Make sure your protagonist is active is a piece of writing advice that I have heard ever since I first started writing. An active protagonist being one that actually takes steps forward to move the plot along, as opposed to just reacting to their environment or to exterior conflicts. This is objectively good advice, and you can find examples of active protagonists that have existed for thousands of years. Everything from Odysseus fighting his way back to Ithaca, to John Wick digging up his stash of weapons to avenge his puppy. But what about horror? It's a genre that's known for its antagonists, but how good is it at following this piece of writing advice, of creating active protagonists? The reason that I've been thinking about this is because I'm currently writing a horror novel, and I'm about to have the main character make a critical decision that's going to move the plot into Act 2. And it's mainly because I've had this piece of advice bouncing around in my head for so long. But the more that I thought about this, the more that I realized that the horror genre has a different kind of relationship to this type of advice and the whole idea of an active protagonist. And there's three main thoughts that I had about this kind of relationship that the genre has to this piece of advice. The first thing I thought about is that sometimes passive characters make the story scarier. Take the movie The Strangers, for instance. This is about as straightforward of a horror story as you can get. A couple has their house broken into by masked psychopaths, and they're basically just terrorized for the next 90 minutes. There really isn't a whole lot of problem solving on display. They are not what you would call active characters. And their passivity, at least when it comes to how the plot moves forward, is partly what makes it so scary. They have no control in this situation. And it makes me wonder if you had a version of The Strangers where you had more of your standard active protagonists that were problem solving and were more successful in fighting back and moving the story forward. Would it be a better story? Maybe. But it would not be The Strangers. It would not be the uniquely scary movie that it is. A much more extreme example would be something like 2008's Martyrs, which also has fairly passive protagonists, especially in the last half, and it's the weakness and the complete vulnerability of that character that makes it one of the scariest movies of all time. I also recently talked about Scott Smith's novel The Ruins, which follows four protagonists who are trapped in this one location, and the story is them basically just reacting to this awful situation that they're in. And yet, the story works really, really well, not only in terms of how scary it is, but how that sense of helplessness actually impacts the way that you think about the characters. They don't feel like gears moving the story forward. They really do feel like real people. A second thought that I had about this relationship between horror and more active protagonists is that even in the horror stories where there are active protagonists, they often emerge in the story as opposed to existing at the outset. In the hero's journey understanding of story that Joseph Campbell writes about, you have the protagonist crossing the threshold. This is where the character has answered the call of adventure and is now stepping out the door. This is Bilbo, literally crossing the threshold and following the dwarves on an adventure. But what about Alien, or The Thing, or The First Evil Dead, or Green Room? Ripley is an iconic protagonist who could hardly be called passive, but she doesn't really emerge as a driving force of the story and then the franchise until the last act of that first movie. And even in Dan O'Bannon's original script, you didn't have this singular, forceful protagonist. The main crew were described as unisex in that original script. They had no real unique identity, at least as he originally envisioned them. And yet when you watch Alien, the characters, including Ripley, are fascinating and they feel like real people. Nobody's going to say that it's a bad story. It's just that the story is more interested in the group dynamic rather than the self-actualization of a single protagonist. You see something very similar in The Thing. MacReady and his flamethrower eventually emerge as driving forces of the story, but that's not really what the story is about. It's more about this group of people being infected and broken apart by suspicion and distrust. I also love how The Troop by Nick Cutter does this really, really well, where it creates sort of a mix between The Thing and Lord of the Flies, where you're following a group of Boy Scouts trapped on an island, and there's this hunger-inducing parasite that's getting spread from one to the next. It's a great story, and one that, again, doesn't have that one singular protagonist that is solving the problems of the story. A final thought I had on this relationship between active protagonists and horror is that there are examples of active protagonists in horror stories who cross the threshold, who move the story forward, who go on a hero's journey. It just doesn't usually look the same as it does in other stories. Take the film Audition, for example. After the inciting incident of his wife's passing, Shigeharu, who's a TV producer, hosts a fake audition to meet a potential spouse. He literally tries out a bunch of women in the hopes that one of them will stand out and they can strike up a relationship. This is a very proactive decision by the protagonist that launches the story into Act 2. But this decision doesn't lead to any kind of positive growth over the course of the story. It leads to a lot of consequences, and the kinds of consequences you can't scrub from your brain after you've seen them. And Audition comes from a long tradition of horror stories in which the protagonist makes a decision at the outset which sets off a tragic chain of events later on. Famously, we see this in W. W. Jacobs' 1906 short story, The Monkey's Paw, which spawned countless variations on the idea of a wish gone wrong, all the way up to 2026's Obsession by Curry Barker. And speaking of a completely different Barker, I just finished reading The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker, which has a very active protagonist in the character of Julia, who is determined to resurrect her dead lover, regardless of how many bodies it takes to do so. In some ways, she has a somewhat traditional hero's journey. She crosses a threshold into the unknown and experiences this sort of a radical transformation. And that's the common thread with a lot of these horror stories. They're all a sort of dark reflection on the idea of a hero's journey, where it's far more of a downward spiral than any kind of upward or even circular trajectory. There are a lot of other ways that the horror genre plays with the idea of a hero's journey, but as I write my own story, I'm honestly still trying to figure out what I want my character's journey to look like. When it comes to horror, I think I do tend to favor characters who are more active, but thinking through all these examples of horror films and novels that I read where the characters are more passive, I feel like gives me a little bit more freedom. And I think it's really fascinating and helpful to look at examples of characters whose helplessness actually elevated the horror to a degree that it wouldn't have been otherwise. So that's enough procrastinating. One of the reasons that I'm even making these videos is to help incentivize me to actually sit down and write. So I'm going to start writing and try to make a little bit of progress on chapter 3 of my horror novel. Thanks for watching and happy writing.